Well, Dan, we've done another one.
Number 2 in our list of full-length video pilot reports with 2 pilots.
And this is an all-American manufactured aircraft.
Yeah, it's gone through, I think this is the first one, Dave, that's gone through that much of a transition to be a Czech Republic-built airplane that is now 100% built in the USA. So we go and got our airplanes overseas, now we've brought them all the way back here, at least one. And these guys in South Carolina, are doing good.
Now, this airplane is, I guess, sort of a hybrid, though. It's not an all-composite airplane. It's not an all-metal airplane. It has both of them.
Well, I think that makes it a legitimate composite. Composite really means a combination of different things, and we've got a fiberglass body on the airplane, or fuselage, but we got all metal wings. And you know, for the flight schools that are interested in this kind of machinery for flight training, love to have metal wings because they're easily repaired anywhere. It's usually wings that get dinged in hangar accidents and stuff, and that's usually where the damage occurs. So I think that can work for them.
Now, I have a 10-point system. I believe yours is a 9-point system.
I have 9 categories.
Okay.
Yep. So they're what we call the pros and cons. Comes from the good folks at Light Sport and Ultralight Flying. So we say there's some good things, there's some bad things in 9 different categories. They're not bad things, but there are some things that any airplane, none of them are perfect. No airplane ever made has been absolutely perfect, at least for every individual. So some things that I might like, you might dislike, and vice versa. And that's what the give and take really is in an airplane. And the people watching have got to evaluate for themselves, and that's why this may be useful. So why don't we run through our lists?
Okay. Well, one of the things that I evaluate is I need a history on something. You know, you're sitting here, is it a brand new airplane to the market? What's some of the background on the airplane?
So in the United States, there's, I think, 55 of these flying now, but I believe there's about 300 overseas. So this airplane's been around for a little while. This is not a new creation. In fact, the first one of these I flew was called the Allegro 2000, which came from the year it was built. This one's called the Allegro 2007, which means that it wasn't built in 2007, but redesigned, and a significant redesign. The tail's all different, the wing is different. We looked at some views from the air, and you can see it's got a compound wing, meaning that it's not just what's called a Hershey bar, straight on the leading edge, straight on the trailing edge. That's the Hershey bar shape. This has got a much more exotic, a little harder to build wing, but it makes it perform and handle a little better. We'll get to the handling in a bit.
Now, what's one of the first things that you look at in yours?
Well, in my list, and I'm going to kind of peek at my phone here where I've got a checklist on it because I can't remember all these categories that I have, but the first one I do is design points, and we talk about the overall appearance. It's a lovely airplane. As we just said, it's got some nice design features to it. I'm looking at it forward as I glance this direction, and we notice, for example, that the landing gear is not particularly widely spaced. I didn't notice that was any issues when ground handling, which we'll get to in a minute. But there are differences about every airplane. This one is a strut-braced wing. It's not a cantilevered wing. That means there's more space inside over your head. A cantilevered wing takes some of that away. So this is a structure that makes use of the composite shape. That's all good. It's not completely unique among all the many 123 SLSA we have, of which about 100 are fixed-wing airplanes. So there's bound to be some that are somewhat similar to this, but nonetheless, it's somewhat unique in its mixture of metal and composite, and now it's American-made. That makes it cool, too. It has one certification in Europe in various places. Germans in particular have a strong certification system, but this one meets the full ASTM standard, and that's the one that we're using now increasingly in countries around the world. In some other areas, the ergonomics of the inside of the cockpit, it's quite comfortable in there. We'll get to more on that later, but it's not as wide as some of the others. So those are a couple of the downsides. Overhead, I'm not particularly tall. I'm 5'10", and there was not a lot of clearance above my head. So if you're a real tall guy, obviously you could move the seat and adjust it. And it has quite a bit of adjustment. I noticed when you got in. You can comment on that in a bit. And the useful load in this is a little more limited than it is in some of the others. But this is a pretty ideal airplane for flight schools, and they've used it a lot. They have one of these that has 4,000 hours on it, which speaks to the thing that some people say, gee, I don't know if these things are really up for that much flight training. The landing gear may not hold up. Well, not this particular one, but they have one in their flight school at Allegro USA that has 4,000 hours on it. And of course, it's had things fixed and had the engine redone on it and like that because it has to, but it's held up. It's done quite well for them. So that's my design criteria. Now, your 10-point list, what do you start out with?
Well, again, one of the things that I look at is I look at the distribution network. It's fine to have an airplane, for example, in Czechoslovakia or the Czech Republic, but what happens when it gets here? Where do you get parts? Where do you get service? Where do you get flight training? So looking at this is, although it is an older company, this is a new design, and they're basically just starting from day one. And they don't have a dealer network really set up across the United States yet. So that's just one of the criteria that
they are building it, I know, and at least the parts are American sourced, and they all come from here. So with good services like UPS and FedEx and whatnot, should be able to get parts anywhere in the country pretty quickly.
Yeah.
And more places like U.S. Aviation, for example, are taking over some of the maintenance duties for these guys. So they're not a dealer, but they can service them, and that's going to become more and more common. Addressing your point, I think, David.
Yeah. And again, as you mentioned, this is really a mom and pop operation. If I were to refer to that, this is like a corner store. These people have been there. It's a husband and a wife running the thing, so it's not as if you're dealing with 20 people before you get to someone that you.
Yeah, you can get right to the boss right away, and I suppose if you're a buyer, you can probably call him in the wee hours of the morning, and he's going to answer his phone.
I think we've been over in his booth, and he's getting calls coming in right now. So okay.
Well, so the next category I look at is what I call systems, and this is the things that are on the airplane that allow you to operate it better. For example, this one's got a nice set of flaps in it, and they're centrally located on a switch, so it's electric flaps with an indicator in it. The trim is off to the pilot side, and it's kind of overhead, and it's fairly effective. It's quite responsive. As you move that handle just a little bit, you get quite a bit of action out of it. Now, when I flew from the right seat, I'm an old instructor, so I was flying in the right seat. I can't reach that easily. I have to put my hand right in front of the other person to do it. That's a little bit of a negative in my mind because the trim is not so accessible to the right seat operator. On the other hand, you don't need it much because the stick is quite light. It does have the trim is located here on this is a T-tail airplane, as you can clearly see, and the trim is located on the left side, and it's just a small tab, but it's nonetheless quite effective. Brakes are center brake. This is not differential steering, but it also turns quite tightly, so that's not a big deal on a crowded airport ramp. And it's got a full suite of panel in it. This has the Dynon 7-inch Skyview screens, and those things are just glorious. I learned how to use them a little bit better recently, and man, there's more information than you can shake a stick at. So even though the panel is a little small compared to some other airplanes, it's certainly adequate to have all the stuff in there that you'd like. And the braking action on it was actually quite strong, I found.
Again, a lot of traffic here.
Yeah.
Me being an ultra pilot, not used to it. We went over to Avon Park, which is a few miles.
Great. Okay, good.
And I was very impressed. We had measured it basically wingtip to wingtip with 35 feet or approximately 35 feet, and I was able to turn that airplane around completely without brakes at all in that 35 feet.
Not even using any brakes.
Not any brakes at all. I was just able to. So
that's partly a function of that narrower stance that I spoke to, which in a strong crosswind, that could, I suppose, present some problems, but it was clearly labeled right on the panel what kind of crosswinds you should max out in.
Now, one of the problems that I had was the throttle. A thing I loved about it, it had dual throttle.
Yes, both on each side of you, kind of down by your thighs, about where it is.
And the problem that I had is that I don't know whether I was short-armed or whatever. We had the seats moved forward already because...
you move the seat forward more than
quite
I did,
a bit.
Right?
And in moving the seat forward, I still had a problem getting to the far end of the spectrum.
Your reach forward,
reaching forward on the throttle.
Yeah, so it was a little long for me too, so... and also when I got in, now he had started running the engine before I got in. You normally wouldn't do that, of course, but we wanted to get it warmed up, and it was a cool start to the morning here. But when I got in, I bumped the throttle forward. So that's less than optimal. I would not enter this airplane with the engine running. Just not smart. But then you don't normally do that anyway, so that's hardly a criticism.
So again, operational-wise, I found the straight had that center-mounted stick with the little post off of it.
The instructor post,
post. That worked very well. The trim worked very well. Intercoms.
And brake is on the handle.
On the handle.
Just the bicycle brake system.
And it also had a parking brake, which worked well.
You pull it back first, and then you twist the lever, which locks up the hydraulics.
One of the problems I had was plugging the intercoms. Again, had I done it ahead of time, it may not, you plug it in, you get in. But to get in, you put all your straps on, forgot my intercom, and now I have to really...
You got to undo the straps to get forward and do that.
So again, that's just a little picky thing.
Some things you have to learn about this particular airplane, which is true of any airplane, of course.
And entrance to the airplane, Dan, for me, I broke my back a number of years ago. I'm not really able to bend the way that someone younger could do, or someone that maybe a little more physically fit than I am. So we've had a couple of airplanes, you just slide your feet up in there and you drop them in.
Some are quite easy.
Yeah.
This was a little more challenging.
This was a little more challenging.
Well, there's another factor that enters in, too. Now, the doors, which you can open in flight, which was cool.
Well, we did some video.
Absolutely.
No door on it at all.
And I open cockpit guys like you and I, that's fine by me. But when the door opens, in order not to have it go up and the nearest edge hit the wing, it can't go up quite as high. So you kind of have to duck down in. And there's a little bit of contortion to get in it, and normally high wings are somewhat easier. But then once you sat down, pulling your legs in, it wasn't that bad, and there is some good structure overhead, some steel interior. The fuselage is fiberglass, but there's a welded interior, sometimes called a space frame, that is the main structure, and it's got some good heavy strong points. You can use those to get yourself in, and that helps some of us that are a little less flexible.
You have to be very cautious, though. They have a bar that controls the ailerons that runs right across. They have
You got to look where you're doing it.
That's right. As you're getting in, unless they've told you that, you know, unless somebody is actually instructed, listen, you've got to watch for this red bar. That's the easiest bar to grab a hold of when you're getting in the
Yes, it is. It's kind of right there, and it's red, and you see it. Although, if you look and you see it, it's red.
Yeah.
It should tell you, don't grab this.
Yeah.
But you're right. The one that you want to get is just kind of behind that, and it's much more sturdy, and so you got to be a little bit careful that way.
So, I mean, the other thing was, I was amazed at how comfortable the seats were. They seemed to be so light that I figured, oh God, you know, my back is. We flew that airplane for about 40-45 minutes, and I really felt comfortable even when I got out of the airplane.
Well, and another nice thing I like to look for is I like to have the seat cushion come further down on my leg. Some seats are so short, they're about mid-thigh, like they are in most airliners, actually, that your leg isn't as well supported. If you have a longer flight, you'll experience fatigue. This has almost like those chairs that have a flip-up footrest. It's not quite that way, but it's kind of similar. It supports your leg much further out. I found it quite comfortable too, and both of us are a little picky about seats, so it speaks well to that.
And when I first got into it, I had other camera equipment with it when I was filming it, and it's hidden away. You don't even know it's there, but you just move it aside, and your storage area is right there behind the seat.
Right and convenient. Now, one thing about the doors, they're easy to open and close. There are gas pistons to hold them, and they keep them from slapping around, but there is only one pin point. Normally, there's a pin point toward the front, because if you get air coming in that front there, it could peel away your door. So that might be a negative, but the good news is, I mean, you flew the airplane with the door removed.
Yeah.
And it wasn't a big deal. And they say up to 70, I think it's miles an hour, you can pop open the doors and close the doors at will. So the comment about the door and its latching, not so important because the airplane can handle that kind of duty.
Okay, what do you got on yours?
Well, let's go to ground handling a little bit. I found we talked about this a little bit, and we can go through this part kind of quickly, I think, because the ground handling actually was quite good, despite what looks like, I'm going to step away from the camera a little bit, that may be, I don't know, maybe about 6 feet of gear stance,
yeah.
And that seems a little narrow compared to some, but I didn't notice anything. I didn't notice it wobbling around on the ground. So the gear is obviously well suited to the airplane, and even though they're not widely out there, it's quite stable in turns, and the braking was good, we said.
Well, I flew in to Avon Park, and we had a good 10-15 mile an hour crosswind.
Okay. I didn't have that experience here, so you had a little different experience.
And I put this airplane down, and again, first time that I've flown this particular airplane for a number of years now. And it handled the crosswind, it handled the stand. I had no problem at all. I mean, even having the going on the mains in a crosswind and still with the nose a little bit high, and just no problem at all.
So again, it speaks well to a flight school airplane. Now, when you're flying this airplane, I'm going to kind of jump ahead here to take off some landings and combine that a little bit with handling characteristics. This is a rudder airplane. You got to fly the rudder. You got to move your feet. This is a little bit like a tail dragger in that if you don't use the rudder, you will not make coordinated turns. There are some airplanes you can just drive around with the yoke or joystick. This is not one of them. The good news for a flight student is if you don't come into this with like a private pilot that used to fly in, let's say, a Skyhawk, which you can almost drive around with your feet on the floor, you won't be able to do that in this airplane. But a new student who learns how to fly this airplane, he's not going to think or she's not going to think anything of that. They'll just learn how to fly this airplane. The student of this airplane that gets into a 172 later on is going to go, I got this, no problem. So it's really a good trainer in that sense, but you do have to use your feet.
Now, again, when I was flying the airplane, one of the things that I like to do a turn, like a 180 degree turn or a 360, with just the rudder, and then another with just the rudder on.
And what'd you find out when you did that?
The rudder, no problem at all. I had to work the ailerons, and the instructor that I was amazed that we were able to do it without any problem at all. I mean, once I got that nose to come over, I could coordinate it all the way around. But it was just getting that nose past that adverse yaw point. But once we got that, it was in the feel and everything else. The other thing that I really liked about this airplane, it was demonstrated to me half a dozen times, was that in coming in for a landing, all I really had to do was just trim the airplane and let the airplane come in and basically land itself. I mean, it needed me to do the leveling.
You got to do the round out stuff, yeah.
But once it trimmed itself, once the nose was at the attitude that it was, basically all I'm there for is just
very straightforward landing.
Straightforward landing.
So that again speaks well both to the airplane for recreational use by a pilot that's used to it, and for a new student.
Yeah.
Not going to be challenged too hard. One of the things that I did notice, and I did my little Dutch roll thing, and I did very shallow ones because we were doing that while we were trying to do some aerial photography. But I always like, I was going to do the flying then, and I like to do Dutch rolls. Dutch rolls is keeping the horizontal line, the longitudinal line of the airplane straight, rocking the wings about it. That requires a coordinated use of ailerons and rudder to achieve that, and a little bit of cross controlling is necessary, and you need to stay ahead of it. Well, I started out a little sloppy because of that sensitive rudder, but that came along in just a few banks, and then it's actually quite easy to do that with. It's quite a responsive airplane in its handling quality.
Now, one of the things that we were flying that I didn't know at first was we're flying on 80 horses.
That's right. I love the 80 horse engine. I know everybody loves a 100 horse engine, and it's only a couple of $1,000 more. I understand why everybody gets it, but the 80 horsepower engine has got a couple of advantages that stand out in my mind, and you're much more engine tuned than I am, Dave, so you can comment further. But two things. Number one, it uses not premium unleaded, but regular unleaded. So there's 30 or 40 cents a gallon, and over the lifetime of owning an airplane, that's going to add up to quite a bit of money, especially as fuel prices keep climbing. The second thing is that it's just working the engine a little less hard. And therefore, while the 100 horsepower engine, Phil Lockwood right here on the Sebring Airport has torn down one that was in a flight school, 100 horsepower with 2,000 hours on it, said it was clean and great looking. So the engine does fine with 100 horsepower, but anytime you work an engine less hard, it's going to last you even longer. And so I love the 80 horse, and you know what? I found the climb was just fine, the takeoff roll was quick. Okay, 100 horsepower is going to do those things a little better or a little faster, but do you need it? I love the 80 horse. What do you think?
This 80 horse on this particular airplane really worked well. I mean, I was amazed. Our cruise speed, we were cruising along 5,000, 5,100, and we were clocking pretty close to 130 miles an hour.
Yeah, it scoots right along. On 80 horse, this is.
80 horse. And then just for cruising around, we backed it down to, I think it was 45, 4,600.
Yeah, 46 was the number my pilot used.
And it was a game. It was a nice, comfortable feeling airplane. And I don't know why anybody would want 100 horse on this unless they were going to floats or unless they had...
Or high elevation.
Yeah.
There are some places where you'd want it, and certainly float operations.
But the airplane itself is designed so that with that 100 horse, it's like you're flying with 100 horse.
It's doing great on that number, isn't it? So let's talk a little bit now about some of the control mechanisms and the performance. You just mentioned a pretty good speed number. While we were up aloft, we did a stall, so you can see that in the video. I don't know where that'll come in here as you do the editing on it, but the stall was, I did a very gentle one because we didn't want to get too far apart on the airplanes, but the stall was just a non-event. I mean, it broke, and you knew it, but it didn't have to do hardly anything. I added no extra power whatsoever, dropped the nose just a little bit, right back up to speed and flying nice.
Yeah. No, again, we no problem with the stalls at all. There was no surprise. It didn't drop a wing. It was just a nose down. Things started to fly right away.
Another nice thing I noticed is in turns. Now, you got to use the rudder pedal and ailerons to get into the turn.
It's got a long wing on it.
But once you're in, it just carves right around and does good. And you just mentioned an interesting point. This tapered wing that they've got at the compound shape of the wing gives this thing a 12-to-1 glide. Now, for reference, a Cessna 150, old standard benchmark in the flight school environment, that's about 9.5. 9.5 to 12 may not sound like a lot, but that's a lot more reach. So if something fails on this airplane, pretty unlikely that engine's ever going to quit, but if it is, you can reach quite a ways. 12 to 1s means that you're at 2,000 feet up in the air. You got quite a long ways. You got 24,000 feet. That's almost 5 miles from 2,000 feet before you're going to get to the ground. That's some decision time to figure out what you need to do should some problem arise.
No, we're still talking about the engine department, that type of thing. One of the drawbacks, again, in a flight school is I want to be able to get that engine quickly. I don't want to have to take a whole bunch of buttons or screws or whatever. I'm going for a flight at 8 o'clock. I don't have time to do a half an hour of taking everything apart.
Well, yeah, in a flight school, it's about getting that airplane in the air, not about wrenching on it on the ground.
So one of the drawbacks of this particular airplane that we're flying today, and they indicate there's differences in airplanes that fly to flight schools, there really is no quick and easy way to get at that engine to inspect it, to check the oil, the radiator, for that type of thing. Now, as I say, they indicate that in their flight school environment they have some sort of a...
they call it a hood.
A hood.
Just like in a car, more of it opens up so you can access it easily. You can see more of what's going on inside there. Real important for the flight school environment. Of course, if you have to wrench on it, well, then you're going to take the whole cowling off. And it's not that many screws. But you wouldn't want to do it on a daily basis or before the next student comes out. And so that's something that they have addressed, but we didn't see on this particular
airplane. We didn't see it on this airplane.
One thing I want to comment about is fuel load. It holds 17 gallons of fuel. By a lot of standards, that's, well, let's say the flight design CTLS, that holds 35 gallons, twice as much fuel. Clearly going to go a lot longer. But then I always say to people, well, that's great. It's nice to have all that fuel on board, but my body can't go that long. I got to land and stretch and use the facilities and like that. So to me, the 17 gallons, that translates to probably 3+ hours and still leaving some reserve. For me, that's just fine. And certainly in a flight school,
I mean, you don't want to go that.
You're coming and you're not carrying all that fuel around and paying to carry around fuel that you may never use. If you've got 35 gallons on board, you may never go down to the 10-gallon point. So you're carrying around 60, 80, 100 pounds that you're not even using. Feels good, but you're carrying that weight around. And you're paid to carry it around.
And one of the other things that people don't realize that the engine needs that octane to fly with. It needs that either 87 or the 91. And the longer the fuel is left stored, so if you had, for example, 30 gallons of fuel in there and you didn't fly for 4 or 5 months, that 30 gallons of fuel has lost a lot of octane, which is a detriment to the operation.
Yeah, right. And so you almost need to drain it then. So really, having a lot of fuel is mostly a feel-good for pilots. Just plan your time better. Land at a few more places. We've got airports everywhere in this country. And besides, they'd like you to stop in, buy a little fuel from them. You're not going to have to buy much, and it won't cost you much. And I don't know what the burn is on the 80 horse. Do you know what the numbers are?
I'm using 2.5 gallons an hour.
2.5 gallons an hour. So, I mean, compare that to anything. The Cessna 150, again, are one of our benchmark trainers. They say 5.5, but realistically, it's more like 6+. Mm-hmm. No more a little more horsepower, but it weighs a little more, so the equivalent performance, well, there's no question, this outperforms the Cessna 150 in almost every parameter. So as a trainer, this is a high-performance trainer, if you will. Let's talk a little bit about stability. I talked about the stall. That was just a non-event. We talked about the fact that you do have to use the rudder, but boy, you take hands off in level flight, it tracked really well. It's got a pretty good-sized tail on it. It's not so tall, but it's got a lot of volume, or a lot of good dimension this way, and I found it to be quite a stable flyer. What's your thought?
Well, I had an instructor take off with trim, not touching the stick at all, and we basically did a whole circuit coming in, and he never touched the stick. I kid you not, when he came in, he trimmed the airplane for the flaps, the nose came up, and we basically did a whole circuit, and all he did was at the end just come in and touch the stick. He had his hands off the stick for the whole circuit other than the touch stick.
Wow, so that speaks about as loudly as you can to an airplane that wants to fly straight and true and does not require a lot of pilot input. When you do turn it, you will need to use a little coordination of the controls, but that's a basic pilot skill you need to have anyway.
And it's rudder dominated, which is a game.
Definitely it is. So. All right, so overall, should you buy this airplane? Well, one of the things that's very important to Americans is the fact that it is, or Canadians or Mexicans too that want to buy this, it's coming out of America, the parts are here, you don't have to call way overseas. Not that those people can't give some good service, but you got a big time difference, you got a language difference, you got a lot of physical distance, and if parts had to come from overseas and all of that, it just takes longer. Here you've got an American-sourced airplane, every part of it's American-sourced, except for the engine, but almost everybody uses a Rotax or a Jabiru. They're both imported too, so no difference there, and the service on those is just fine anyway, so really not an issue that way. The price point, I don't have those numbers right in front of me, but it's always been a little lower priced airplane, so you're not going to spend the same money, and yet you get quite a nice airplane.
I mean, they've got a sky view in this.
Yeah, dual sky view. And the 7 inches, we've all been enamored by the big 10-inch screens, and it's like watching your widescreen TV in your living room. Those are great, but I found the 7 inches, first time I've flown to the 7-inch sky views, I didn't really notice any difference. In a short time, it felt like I was looking at bigger ones, and they fit the panel really nice.
They do. And the other, I'm flying from the instructor seat, and I'm just glancing over. And Dan, I had no problem reading anything.
Right. Yeah, you flew from the right side, as did I, and they had it arranged. I'm sure it was the same for you. The sky view, the view of the world, whether you can see the world or not, is on the left, and they had the engine instruments and the moving map on the right.
Yeah.
So both of us were eyeballing the left side, where airspeed and altitude and so forth. No problem. You get both a digital view and kind of an analog view by needle movement. I found it no sweat at all to see all of that, including the little, it's an electronic ball.
Yeah.
Now, I've always been an advocate of that little curved tube with the ball in it and the benzene, and I think they are still, there's no question, they're more sensitive. If you really want to get fine adjustment, you still need that, but the electronic ball worked fine.
Now, maybe in an ultralight pilot, Dan, I ignore, half a dozen times.
You didn't notice it had a ball.
The instructors tell me, a little more left, a little more, and wait a minute, I'm flying this the way that feels comfortable to me.
You feel it, you're back in your bottom side, and once you get a little experience with it. Of course, you and I just hopped in it and flew it, so we don't have that yet, and so I've always said, pilot of many maybe, but master of almost none. Anybody that puts 10 hours in this thing is going to outfly me in it, and in 10 hours of flying in this airplane for someone already experienced in aviation, you're going to have a ball with it. So I think on a wrap up here, we've hit some of the high points. Of course, there's always more. You need to call the factory and get even more information. We'll give you all that information here at the end of the video. But I would say this airplane gets high points from me.
Yes, it does for me too. Basically because the airplane, for me, was designed and built for a training environment. And that's where my heart is. I want an airplane that is not going to surprise me, not going to surprise my students, gives good money for its value, and that was the other thing. I went on the internet before we came down here. I'm glancing through. This airplane is holding its value. An airplane.
That's a very good point for a buyer.
Yeah.
Whatever the purchase price is, one thing. What's it worth when you had it for 5 years and you decide to move to something else?
These airplanes are holding their value. So
excellent.
It's like I say, to me, it's a good all-around airplane and rates very high on the schemes that I use.
So we give it high points to the Allegro 2007. Now from Allegro LSA. Right here in the USA.
Do we have a web address for them or not?
I think it's Allegro USA. But
I'm going to drop that in, so it's not a problem.